So the idea that Renaissance humanism is somehow exclusively Western and uninfluenced by other cultures itself is a false point of departure. It's interesting to even think about the American Declaration of Rights, which of course is perhaps the most important instrument together with the Magna Carta and the French Declaration on the Rights of Man. So the Virginia Bill of Rights in 1776 was inspired in part by the example of Cyrus the Great, the founder of the Persian Empire in 450 BC. And in particular, there was the book of the Greek philosopher Xenophon called Cyropaedia, which influenced greatly Thomas Franklin and the other founding fathers who saw Cyrus the Great as a champion of religious freedoms. It's rather ironic to think about that. 450 years ago, the so-called Cyrus cylinder of Cyrus, which was a brick cylinder in which a number of edicts were written, freed many of the slaves which were enslaved by the Babylonian Empire, and established that all people should have religious freedom. So I would say that that point of departure itself has to be questioned. But having established that there are all sorts of, if you like, non-European roots to the modern notion of human rights, it is true that human rights as a legal construct was very much shaped by a European experience. It's the experience of the Enlightenment. But that's only half the story. It's not merely that with the decline of the Dark Ages and the start of the Enlightenment, Europe somehow magically achieved progress and arrived at the notion of human rights. The other side of that narrative is, if we go back to the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which ended the Catholic-Protestant wars, and we fast forward 400 years to 1948, which is the year in which the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by the United Nations, we see 400 years of wars, revolutions, and genocide, an extremely violent history which gave birth to the notion of human rights. So the idea that human rights emerged in the Western political or historical space is not always a compliment. It is also a reflection of the extreme violence of modernity. There is a story about the United Nations official which went to Papua New Guinea in 1975 when Papua New Guinea was becoming independent. And he remarked to one of the Papuans that he was shocked that there were still cannibal tribes in Papua New Guinea, which is true, there were at the time. And apparently the Papuan had responded to him, he says, "Unlike your people, my people never kill more than they can eat." So one can really think in terms of the narrative of progress. And when we look at those which historically we called primitive, and we look at the record of the 20th century, which many historians have called the century of genocide, one begins to wonder, insofar as the violence of the modern age makes anything that we've had in the historical past pale in comparison. And perhaps it was that unprecedented violence, perhaps more so than the Enlightenment ideas, that forced human rights to emerge from its particularistic Western context to become a universal force. And it was in that context, ultimately, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948, together with the Genocide Convention, and also the notion of crimes against humanity was, oops, I'm just going to put this here. The right to water. Okay. So I think that the whole argument that human rights are a Western concept is a partial truth at best. And even if there is some truth to it, the context within which we understand it can make us see the critique in a very different light. So I begin with that because I'd like to put that argument aside and look at human rights as a reality. 60 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, human rights are a reality, and even those states that challenge human rights still invoke its terms. Even Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge would not challenge human rights as such, but would say that the accusations of human rights violations were all part of some sort of imperialist conspiracy. And even those states, such as the Islamic Republic of Iran, Saudi Arabia, that invoke, let's say, the Sharia law as a challenge, as a cultural relativist challenge, still want to appropriate human rights. We have an Islamic Declaration of Human Rights. We have an Arab Declaration of Human Rights. So it's not a wholesale rejection of human rights, but rather an attempt to bring in a nativist narrative and to actually claim ownership of human rights, to say that this is not somehow your sole preserve or monopoly. So what do we make of human rights, and what I think is the real challenge that we need to be considering? And in order to answer that, I want to go back once again to the history of the Enlightenment to understand the emergence of human rights as what I would call a secular religion. And Emile Durkheim explains to us that the notion of the sacred is not merely a religious concept. The sacred space can exist equally in a secular society. And the sacred space merely represents unimpeachable axioms, which we accept as really a fundamental article of faith. Who is to say that the sanctity of human life is somehow a logical proposition? It's not a logical proposition. It's an article of faith. So when we read the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, when we read the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which speaks about rights as being inalienable, somehow inherent in humankind, well, that is a great leap of faith. It is based on an assumption that we have about the nobility and value of human beings, the capacity of human beings to use their faculties, to behave in a way which we consider to be sort of worthy in a spirit of brotherhood, to quote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or sisterhood, if we want to be gender neutral. So human rights became the secular religion in part because of the decline of Christianity, which was one of the most important developments in the emergence of the Enlightenment. But it's not just the decline of Christianity that explains the emergence of Enlightenment ideas. What we forget once again in this historical narrative is that the vacuum that was created with the decline of Christianity was filled by a number of utopian ideologies, which gave birth to totalitarian states. And it was those totalitarian states that were responsible for the mass murders and genocide, which I referred to earlier. So in a sense, these totalitarian ideologies filled in that vacuum and gave really a kind of substitute religion to modern, rational, secular man. And I will say man/woman, but more man, because they were the ones that were causing most of the trouble. So let's look a bit at the whole notion of utopian ideologies and the relation to liberal secular ideology. When we think about liberal secular ideology, the ideology of freedom, the notion that somehow the state is there to protect our sphere of autonomy, that's the sort of, in the most simplistic fashion, the underlying notion of any liberal ideology. It's not a very inspiring ideology when you think about it. I read once to my students a speech which spoke about heroism, sacrifice, the glory of the motherland, the fatherland, and I asked them what do they think about this speech, and they just all said that it was so inspiring. Who wrote that speech? I said, well, the speech was written by Goebbels, Hitler's chief propagandist. So when we look at the so-called romantic ideologies, such as Marxism, communism, National Socialism, fascism, racialism, all of them appealed to a greater good. None of them saw themselves as being radically evil. And all of them had a vision of a great society, a utopia. So it was not without the profound disillusionment that resulted from the gross failure of those ideologies that we effectively retreated into a liberal ideology. And a liberal ideology is about the lowest common denominator, is it not? It's about the state not invading our autonomy. It's about the state not imposing a particular belief or ideology. And in that sense, the notion of liberalism, or what some political theorists call the procedural republic, the state is merely a set of rules and procedures to ensure that we can all realize the greatest deal of freedom. It's not a particularly inspiring ideology. So the content of our culture is not about the Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Parliament and the Supreme Court and the separation of the branches of government, the sort of institutions and norms which give a specific modernist expression to the notion of human rights and make it really a responsibility of the state to respect certain norms. But the substance of our culture comes from somewhere else. And we have to admit that despite the great freedoms that we have in Western society, that another not so pleasant side of this culture is the culture of consumerism, a culture of greed, a culture of vanity, of crass materialism. And I'm sure we could have a debate about this, and for the sake of brevity, I'm just giving you very perhaps gross generalizations. But I'm saying this because much of the world looks at Western culture not through the prism of a set of legal institutions and abstract norms, but much of the world looks at the West as a package deal, if you like, and looks not just at the lofty ideals which we espouse in Western culture, but they also look at the highly individualistic, socially fragmented, materialistic beliefs, which are a profound threat to traditional communities built around belonging, something which perhaps doesn't feature so prominently in our society. For the most part, the modern concept of human rights is based on the notion of an atomized individual. It is a reflection of a transition from tradition to modernity, a transition from human beings as belonging to tightly knit communities, families, communities, religions. And the notion of course, individual rights is that the individual enjoys rights irrespective of that belonging. It was about protecting the individual against the collective, against the group. And we still have this sort of impulse where, for example, we talk about self-government for First Nations in Canada, but at the same time we have to reconcile that with the notion of individual rights. So much of the reaction against the Western world, in what I will explain in the metaphor of Benjamin Barber, professor at University of Maryland, whose book title is very telling. It's called Macworld versus Jihad. And it really is a very, very profound symbol of Macworld, the sort of crass, materialistic, homogenizing culture which destroys individual. This is the interesting thing, that the sort of consumerist culture on the one hand is built on supposed individualism, but it is very much a homogenizing culture. It's one that eradicates, erases distinctive expressions of differing cultures. And we have to bear in mind that colonialism, which was sort of the imposition of alien political and economic structures, in many respects is far less threatening than a cultural invasion, which redefines the most intimate relations between husband and wife, parents and children, one's sense of belonging to the community and religion and belief, and all of these very profound, intimate ties, which go not just to the notion of we are being dominated by the British or the French or the Portuguese or whoever happens to be the colonial power, and we want political freedom and so on and so forth, but it invades one's innermost space and one's most intimate relations. So the notion of human rights very often has been exported as a package deal, if you like, together with all these other elements of Western society, which some people in the world may appreciate, but which others may see as threatening and alienating and so on and so forth. And of course, jihad in this context represents a reaction through a highly violent, particularistic identity as a means of resisting this homogenization. And I think that it goes without saying that it's not a particularly constructive or appealing response. I want to just reflect briefly on this whole notion of jihad, political Islam, and so on and so forth, the issue which we simply cannot escape today in light of everything that is happening in the world, whether in Syria and Iraq or what happened here in Ottawa some time ago in Parliament, where the issue was, well, was this man, this lone crazed gunman, really inspired by the caliphate of the Islamic State, or was he just a crazy man who happened to see some random video and use that to legitimize his actions? But one of the things that I find very revealing is the way in which we so easily buy into the notion of a clash of civilizations. The sort of idea that what we're witnessing in the rise of the Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria, or for that matter, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Saudi Arabia, that this is all about a rejection of Western culture and a clash of civilizations. As with most other concepts, we have to go back and see where this idea emerged. And the clash of civilizations was the title of an essay written by Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard University in 1993. And it was inspired by the ethnic war and ethnic cleansing that was occurring in Bosnia-Herzegovina with the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia. And Huntington's idea was that with the end of the Cold War, the ideological cleavages that define global politics will now be replaced by the divisions reflecting different civilizations. And his theory was that, of course, in Bosnia, the Bosnian Muslims, the Serbian Orthodox Christians, and the Croatian Catholic Christians, of course, they're killing each other because they represent the fault lines of, I don't know, the Ottoman Empire and the Habsburg Empire. And this was his thesis, which gained tremendous currency. And in particular, because Francis Fukuyama had written about the end of history, the triumph of Western liberalism, this sort of much more sober and cynical view of history all of a sudden became very fashionable. But I wonder if Professor Huntington had ever visited Bosnia or read a single book or spoken to a single person from that society, because I was in Bosnia at the time, in the middle of the war, working with the United Nations, and everyone I met in Sarajevo came from a mixed marriage. And statistically, half of the population all came from mixed marriages. And as Warren Christopher, who was the US ambassador in Belgrade at the time, wrote in his book, Origins of a Catastrophe, he said that what happened, there was plenty of historical tinder in Yugoslavia, but what happened was not a case of spontaneous combustion. Pyromaniacs were required. The so-called ethnic entrepreneurs, those like Slobodan Milosevic, that instrumentalized ethnicity and identity through the process of, othering and creating fear and hatred and violence, which is one of the most convenient instruments of power. And it took quite a lot of effort to translate those tensions into systematic violence and genocide. So it occurred to me that when we look today also at Afghanistan and Iraq and Iran and the region, do we really understand the anatomy of the violence, where this violence came from, what it really represents? So the 18-year-old that calls himself a jihadist, including, the British rapper who apparently beheaded the American journalist James Foley. Is he somehow a repository of ancient identities, of sort of an Islamic essence that he has retrieved from the past? Is he somehow more at home in 7th century Medina, or more at home in a violent video game, a bit like Columbine on crack. You know the story about the Columbine students who apparently were influenced by these violent video games. And when you look at an unemployed 18-year-old youth in Mosul, in northern Iraq, who has only known the corruption and tyranny of Saddam Hussein's regime and the violence of the American invasion and what followed afterwards, who probably is very much influenced by American media, by the imagery of Hollywood, who's suddenly given an SUV, a gun, cash, a cell phone, and a license to murder and rape. Is he more at home in the 7th century Caliphate, or is he more at home in a modern violent video game? So we begin to see that we try to create these very facile abstractions through the clash of civilizations, which disengage us from really understanding the reality of those societies, or which were the regimes, many of whom were Western allies, that helped use religious extremism for many, many years as an instrument of control and violence and projection of their power through proxy wars. So when we look at it in those terms, perhaps radical Islam becomes less about a past, a real past, more about an imaginary past that is retrieved for present purposes. And political Islam, despite its idea of a return back to retrieve some sort of authentic identity that was lost in the face of this cultural homogenization, becomes more like a modern romantic ideology. When we look at the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini in 1979, in the constitution, included a provision saying that the merger of state and religion represents a return to the authentic Islamic past before we were corrupted by Western ideals. Now, you ask anyone who's a historian of Shiite Islam, which was adopted in 1501 as the state religion in Iran, about where one can find a merger of state and religion anywhere in Shiite history. On the contrary, the most orthodox Shiite clerics believe that there must be a separation of state and religion until the return of the 12th Imam, this being the messianic figure. And many of them are still opposed to the Islamic Republic based on their very orthodox religious beliefs. So this was a political construction, it was mythology pure and simple, and although still today one in Iran has to deal with these terrible human rights issues such as child marriages, of which there were some 40,000 last year according to the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights, some girls as young as 9 years of age, one sees that this is all taking place in the context of a modern totalitarian state with an intelligence apparatus, with torture chambers, with a media that systematically, in a very sophisticated way, engages in propaganda. And it no longer seems to be something rooted in the past, and it resembles more perhaps what one could call infantile regression, trying to run back into your mother's womb because the modern global cosmopolitan world is somehow threatening. So I would say that whether it's the book of Stephen Hopgood or others that see this resistance to human rights, that one needs to understand the complexity, the multiple layers through which these societies in a historical transition from tradition to modernity, a transition that took Europeans 400 years of wars and revolutions and genocide, but which these other societies are undergoing in a matter of 2 or 3 generations with tremendous upheaval, tremendous disruption, not only of political and economic structures, but of family relations, community relations, and the rapid transformation of identity to the point where even among generations, there is not a common language which can sort of connect these different generations. So in that context, what we see as this resistance, I think, goes to a rejection, perhaps sometimes, of a materialistic way of life, it goes to rejection of social fragmentation. And it's not so much about human rights ideals, but more about a different conception of dignity, which we perhaps don't understand so much in our modern societies, where we celebrate individuals and we celebrate autonomy, understandably, given the abuses of state authority in our own history. But as a cultural force, that fragmentation creates a lot of alienation. And one could equally say that the man, the lone gunman, that all of a sudden was inspired in his mind by Islam or whatever he understood of it, to pick up a gun and to go and kill that poor soldier down the road from here and to try and attack the parliament, was perhaps more someone who was inspired by his own alienation than someone who had any realistic understanding of what this thing called, radical Islam means. So I'm just going to end by saying that it's not so much that human rights is in retreat, but it's more that human rights is not enough. Human rights is only one slice of the truth. Human rights is a legal institutional expression of human dignity, which emerged from a particular historical context, which for the most part has been embraced through much of the world. And even those that challenge the concept, challenge it not by rejecting it, but by appropriating it and clothing it in their own particular language and historical and religious traditions. What is the real challenge in dealing with the violence which we see in the world is a consumerist culture, a homogenizing culture of greed, corruption, extreme inequalities between rich and the poor, social polarization, which then instrumentalizes identity and unfortunately very often violence as a means of resistance, rather than finding a more profound, perhaps spiritual and moral understanding of the meaning of power and resistance. So I will stop there and open the floor for questions. Thank you.
There's microphones here and here. So please put your questions in, and if you have a question, please introduce yourself first.
I'll just try to break the ice. That was a wonderful presentation. It's been a long time since I've been in university, so I felt that was very erudite. There's many things I could ask you questions about, and maybe it's not fair, you're a lawyer, I'm asking maybe something more historical. But you mentioned that the world appears threatening to, I think you may have been talking about the regime in Iran, or maybe it's them representative of other peoples or regimes. Is there something we in the West can do about that? Are they really threatened? Why do they feel threatened? If you could talk more about that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, I would make a difference between those in power and cultures, because culture is a popular concept. It's about people. And the way in which those in power instrumentalize, I say, cultural relativism as a mask for abuses has to be understood in a very different way than the way in which cultures express themselves. So to give the example of Iran, as I explained, the Islamic Republic of Iran, they say the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman, the Islamic Republic is neither Islamic nor Republic. And there are a significant number of Shiite clerics, including ayatollahs, that are imprisoned in Iran. And when people hear this, they become, quite baffled. That's because they reject this particular interpretation of Sharia. And many of them say that religion has been used as an instrument of oppression and corruption, and that we as spiritual guides for the masses must fight against this instrumentalization of religion. And I would say, using the example of Iran, and one could say the same thing about Saudi Arabia and other places in the region, that let's say Iran is less a theocracy than it is a kleptocracy. There is a tremendous amount of corruption, and much of power, the exercise of power, is about who gets to steal what. And there are all these clans, families, which are basically taking turns, stealing as much as they can from the public coffers, parking it all in the Toronto and Vancouver real estate market, and then saying death to America, death to Canada. So that is not entirely a joke. It's part of the reality of what's going on. It's simply an abuse of power, very cynical abuse of power. And all you need is 10 to 15% of your population as violent, fanatic, brainwashed mobs to stay in power. And that's what we saw in 2009, where millions of Iranians came out in the streets in the Green Movement, rejecting the Islamic Republic, wanting an open society. So that's exactly what I'm trying to say. There's a difference between a mother and father who are worried about the upbringing of their children, or a young person who's alienated because he or she doesn't have a sense of belonging, and the consequences which that has on our dignity and well-being as human beings. That's a very different reality than the cynical, calculated use of cultural relativism. And what can we do in the West? Well, I think there are a lot of things we are doing in the West. One of the interesting things is how in a society which is affluent beyond anything we imagine, although sadly still in Canada 15% of children go to bed hungry. The rate is 40% among Aboriginal children, which should be a cause of shock and horror for those of us living in this society. But leaving that aside, for the most part, we're an incredibly affluent society of tremendous opportunity. And maybe this reminds me of Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You know, when you have everything, what is it that's next in the hierarchy? Self-actualization. And I'm fascinated as a human rights scholar and activist to see how, and Stephen Hopgood refers to this in his book, and I think justifiably, about the human rights industry, and how we approach the issue of human rights in the same crass materialistic way as we approach everything else. So instead of dealing with, let's say, the reality of suffering, of human suffering, and what it means for someone to survive genocide, what it means to actually help someone in a meaningful way, we have, you know, the glamorization of human rights. We have the, what I call sort of making human rights sexy, the Hollywood celebrities coming and making a tearful speech, which is all about superficial sentimentality, and invoking the suffering of victims for our own sort of self-glorification. So what does that say about our culture? Where it says that there's a kind of emptiness that we want to fill in with meaning, whether we're environmental activists, human rights activists, or wanting to volunteer at the soup kitchen down the road. There is a crisis of meaning, I would say, in postmodern consumer society, where sort of instant gratification, what I call slacktivism, you know, activism by pressing a Facebook like and thinking that you're awesome. And that's, you know, so what can we do in the West? I think that we can engage in a much more genuine search for authenticity in our own midst. We can begin to question not the good things that our society has produced, but this crass culture of consumerism, which is breeding despair, alienation in our own midst, and understand that that is also part of human dignity. Human dignity isn't just about, well, in Canada we don't have to worry about being tortured and we have freedom of religion and worship. Well, there's a whole other side to realizing our dignity. And I think that we can also discover that in a transcendent conversation with people from other traditions and cultures, and to find a point of convergence.
Thank you for your presentation. Something that struck me is when you said not so much that human rights is in retreat, but it's not enough. And it's something I've been grappling with, and let me see if I can articulate this in a coherent manner and get your insights on it. Within the human rights system, there's a human rights system, and there's states. The human rights system operates based on state entities. When we're dealing with human rights violations by non-state actors, so you referred to some of what's going on in Iraq right now and in Syria with the Islamic State, should these entities increase in power, since they're not states, the human rights structure may not be sufficient in order to facilitate the protection, promotion of human rights in societies where they may be in power, or even in smaller areas. If human rights is not enough, what do we need to see happen internationally in order to ensure that human rights is promoted and protected when the structures, when societies are experiencing transformation and evolution? And this could also be the case in point in states where they don't have the institutions or the mechanisms or the power to live up to, for example, obligations or promises that they've committed to under the international human rights system.
Okay, thank you. That's Cheshmak, my childhood friend, and during the presentation, the introduction, she was probably saying, I know that guy. I should have introduced him. I know about his misspent youth. Thank you, Cheshmak, for keeping your silence. The check is in the mail. But, oh goodness, I have more checks to write tonight. So the question, if I could sort of make it very simple, is about the difference between state and society, is one way of talking about it. When I talk about culture, I'm speaking about society. And obviously there are reasons why we have state institutions, and we look at the European experience. We had absolutist monarchies, and over the course of the Industrial Revolution and a whole set of other profound changes in European society, we moved from the personification of the state in the person of the monarch. We still have a queen in theory. We still have a person as a monarch. We moved towards modern states with their bureaucracies and institutions, and there's a very good reason why we wanted to create an impersonal state, not a state that is based on the arbitrary power of a single individual. And today, just as in European history, we had the problem of totalitarian states, states with too much power, which is what gave rise to the whole notion of human rights law as a check on abuses of power by the state. We have the problem of failed states, Somalia, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, and we realize that failed states are perhaps sometimes even a bigger problem, because a state that is abusive can somehow over time be changed, but once you have a failed state, to build those institutions from scratch becomes a very, very serious problem. I recently spent a week with the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission, and just to see what it's like in a society like Afghanistan, which has experienced 30 years of mass violence, what does it mean to try and build these institutions? And one of the first things you realize is that the reason why we have a functioning legal system is because of habitual lawfulness. You need a social foundation which can sustain those institutions. So I'm fascinated by a book called The Anthropology of Law by Leopold Pospisil, which in the 1970s challenged the idea that only modern states have legal systems. And Pospisil studied tribal societies across the world, and he came to the conclusion that they also have legal systems. They have very distinct norms, and even though the norms are not implemented through, elected legislature or whatever the case may be, that there is a process of social internalization called shaming. And it's really interesting to think about, let's say, Aboriginal sentencing circles in Canada and the role which they play in bringing a communal dimension to the criminal justice process. So all this to say that it's one thing to have those institutions such as the United Nations Human Rights Council, the treaty mechanism, all of those are necessary. But the most important battleground, if you like, for creating a just society is not in the corridors of the United Nations in Geneva or New York. It's in the societies that are directly affected. And very often, it's not in the corridors of power, whether it's in Parliament or the Congress, but it's in the way we define ourselves as communities. I think about, for example, the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, okay, are a group of mothers who are mourning the loss of their children powerful? Well, typically we wouldn't think that, right? But the mothers of the Plaza de Mayo were incredibly powerful. They came at the height of the military junta in Argentina in front of the presidential palace and defied the tanks and the guns and said, you know what, I'm a mother who's lost my child, I've got nothing to lose. You can shoot me, you can torture me, I want to know what happened to my child. And they became a symbol of resistance, which had a profound impact on the political transformation of Argentina. And even here in Canada, do we also need to redefine what we understand by power? Who are the people that we look to as leaders? Sure, it's easy to elect people and then to realize that they're going to make you promises and you're going to become disillusioned in a matter of time. And every few years, you're going to sort of throw out one group of people that you have been disappointed with and bring in another people that you'll be disappointed with in due course. I mean, is that really what we stand for? Well, of course, it's great that we have a democracy rather than an autocracy. It's great that we don't have an ayatollah sitting, in Ottawa ruling over the country. But we can do a lot better than that. And I just want to end by saying one other thing. There was this great saying of Edmund Burke who said that all that it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. The greatest evils in history occur because majorities are silent when small minorities who are determined and often violent take power and impose their will on others. And I just want to give one example in an extreme case, which may not seem relevant to us in Canada. But in Rwanda, for example, people only took notice of the genocide after it was too late. We only took notice of the fact that there is a place on the map called Rwanda. When CNN headline news or CBC News or whatever showed us all these horrible images of the bodies littering the streets of Kigali, it was almost as if nothing had happened in Rwanda until the genocide. Well, the genocide was for 2 years in the making, and there was a radio station called Radio-Télévision Libre des Mille Collines, which systematically incited people to hatred and genocide. And you may know Leon Mugesera, who was deported from Canada some years ago, was one of the chief sort of propagandists of the Rwandan genocide. So the Supreme Court of Canada, in a case upholding hate speech, famously said that the Holocaust did not begin in the gas chambers. It began with words. So this is shocking but also empowering, because you realize that, yes, by the time 1 million people are being killed in Rwanda, it's probably too late. We feel powerless as ordinary people to do anything, and it falls on our political leaders to do something. But even they are not likely to do anything unless there's a pressing political interest. But we can't simply assume that mass violence, hunger, poverty, disease, these are, natural conditions that we must accept. They are reflections of choices that we make as citizens, as communities, as individuals. So the fact that 40% of our Aboriginal children go hungry is a reflection of who we are as a society. It's not just about telling the people in Parliament to throw more money at communities, or it's a much bigger problem than that. And it's easy for us to wash our hands clean by saying that, well, I've elected my leaders, and I should assume in a democracy that because they're accountable once every few years they're subject to election, that they're going to change all of these evils. Because what do? We surrender responsibility. We take the easy way out. And at best, we see some image of a hungry African child, we feel guilty, we write a check, and we go to sleep, having appeased our conscience. So we need to also look at our own backyard and think about why we have, for example, such extremes of wealth and poverty in this country. This is one of the most prosperous countries in the world. What are we doing about women that are subject to abuse? What are we doing about children that go hungry? What are we doing about all the evils that we have in our own backyard? Never mind what happens halfway across the world. All this to say that that to me is participatory democracy, maybe is one way of speaking about it, or maybe more profoundly, it's about the humanization of culture, moving away from this sort of self-indulgent idea of, I'm a human rights person because I pushed Facebook like for some article that I liked, as opposed to, I'm going to roll up my sleeves. And like an entrepreneur who finds markets to sell his goods, I'm going to find a space in my community where I can touch people's lives and contribute to the greater good.
Thank you for your presentation. I have a question, is a historical and philosophical, I guess. I was wondering, 60 years ago when the Charter of, the Human Rights Charter got ratified by all the countries, it was based on the dignity of human being. I was wondering, was there a discussion between the seculars and the religious people about the base of this dignity? I can imagine the religion people can say God created human being as his image, so that's why he has a dignity. But I was wondering, was there a philosophical discussion between the secular and how they can come to the conclusion, yes, that say very easily that human being has a dignity, and let's talk about his rights now after that. I was wondering, was any discussion or maybe that's the cause of all of these things that happening right now. Different countries says, yes, we have our own version of human rights because of this and that.
It's a very good question, and it's interesting. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, who knows what the beginning words are, whereas Canada is based on the supremacy of God and the rule of law. So we have a reference to God in our Charter of Rights, which is not to be found in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And there were very interesting debates because I believe the Chinese member of the drafting committee, there was a drafting committee which included Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States, Charles Malik of Lebanon, a member from what was then Republic of China, because Communist China was not to come into being until the following year, and René Cassin of France. And the question was whether there should be a reference to God in the Universal Declaration. And I believe as a Chinese member said that, well, the notion of God is, an Abrahamic concept. It's in the sort of Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, but not in our tradition. And these are traditions which are, polytheistic or however you characterize, have a different conception of the divine. So this was a negotiation of different philosophical traditions. And the point about a declaration which is universal in scope is to find something that is acceptable to everyone and not just those from a specific tradition. So the notion that the rights are inalienable can mean many things to many different people. It could be a concept rooted in ration, natural law. It could be rooted in a Taoist tradition, in a Judeo-Christian understanding of man, or whatever the case may be. But a more important question, I think, is not so much what in the abstract is the philosophical justification, because what difference does it make? What difference does it make to how we actually behave? And I think that we have a notion of knowledge which privileges abstractions over intimacy, and it privileges the intellectual over the spiritual and the emotional. And ultimately, when I teach human rights to my class, I have an exercise where I talk about Darfur, genocide in Darfur. We talk about United Nations resolutions, the Statute of the International Criminal Court, and we have a discussion with my students. And then I tell the students about the story of a 4-year-old orphan who lost her parents and what travail she had to go through to walk across the desert to a UN feeding shelter to survive. And I show an image, a shocking image of this child, and then we have another discussion. And the understanding or the knowledge of that reality changes dramatically when it's no longer an abstraction, but when there is a face put to it. So I think that I'm less concerned about, what is the distinct philosophical tradition that we use to justify human rights, but I'm more interested in understanding what is it that brings out that nobility within us, which instead of making us the bystander, the self-righteous bystander who suffers the illusion that he or she is doing something good while actually being indifferent to the suffering of others, what is it that makes us have that authentic conversation with ourselves as to, am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution? Am I willing to sacrifice my comfort and my own selfish interests in order to help others? That to me is the real litmus test, and not so much whether we have to give a particular label to our belief system in order to respect human rights.
Okay, thank you for your presentation.
I think the gentleman there, I think
Yes,
I'm
thank you.
sorry.
Yeah.
You know, I'm not sure. I thought
I've been
the gentleman there
standing
was
here for a while.
first, but
Okay. A number of ideas come to mind and questions, and I'd really be interested in knowing what you see as the compelling political issue of our age that ties in with human rights. Secondly, how do we encourage the good people who are not involved? What specific ways can we encourage the good people to get involved? And the third part of it is, do faith communities have a part in that as well?
to do what?
Do faith to bring people forward in terms of the good people getting involved on the issues in ways that support human rights, that can have a political impact, an impact on the politics of a particular area, such as our own country, Canada. So,
Yeah, I mean, it's a very good question, and I can only give a very brief and incomplete answer, but I think that one of the most precious commodities of our times in the future will be meaning. And this is very interesting because you think about the whole idea of, the pursuit of happiness, to quote, the US Constitution. We all want to pursue happiness, but we live in societies that are consuming more and more and which are less and less happy. If you look at depression, anxiety, and substance abuse and all the ills that we have in our societies, I could understand it in a slum in Bombay much more readily. People are escaping grinding misery every day. But why in our society do we have this degree of alienation and fragmentation? And are we really happy? Are we really doing better off than another society in which people have much more modest lives, but they have stronger ties of family and community and whatever the case may be? It was really interesting. I had a friend who went to Mongolia and he started an adventure tourism company. And he would take highly overpaid bankers from London and New York on $20,000 a week journeys into the Gobi Desert to live with nomads in tents. And he said at night we would sit around the campfire with these Mongolian nomads and we would laugh at the stupidity of these people. Because they would say that, they pay this much money to come and live in our tents. And what is it? What are they buying? They're buying authenticity, right? I want to go, I've been to all the 5-star luxury hotels. I have, my yacht and my 5th sports car and, I don't know, my 6th girlfriend or whatever. I now want to go and experience purity. Think about that. Think about that. We pay this much, go through this much trouble. Maybe the nomad could say, why don't you just, come and live here? It's much easier. So there's something crazy out of balance about our society. And meaning can't be equated with instant gratification. Meaning, I think, necessarily involves struggle and suffering and pain and the breaking of the ego, which is, we talk about empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is when you can transcend your own selfishness and your own ego. You can feel the pain of others. You can connect with others. And how can you be a complete human being until you have broken out of that sort of egotistic state of mind? So whether communities of faith have a role or not, I would say, yes, everyone has a role. And to me, as I said, it's not so important whether we attach a particular label. It's the reality which goes behind what we do. So communities of faith can be a source of, intolerance and fanaticism. They can also be a source of social service and humanity. We have to look not at what people espouse, but what they actually do. And to me, the difference between faith and non-faith is artificial because, as I began by explaining, I think the sacred is an intrinsic part of our nature, which is why human rights in secular society occupies that space. And you see, when we have to define ourselves as Canadian society, what do? We go to the Charter of Rights, we go to our human rights values, because in a multicultural, bilingual, immigrant nation, what is the one glue that keeps us together? It's these core, unimpeachable values that we must all agree upon. And that is the function of the sacred. Whether it's in a religious or non-religious society is less important. The question is, what is it that touches us to not just talk and pay lip service to noble ideals, but to actually do something?
If I could just say, what I'm hearing is whatever the I guess the situation is, it's that sense of belonging, to community, and that can take many forms.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, I got a question from Poland. Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, during last week conference in Poland, it was dedicated to Jan Karski. The keynote, memory and responsibility, was discussed in a broad spectrum. It was stated that the current geopolitical order is outdated and it's missing something. Nonetheless, setting up a new order or reconstructing the current one cannot be conducted by one or just a few states, since it may lead to the situation of disrespecting rights or weaker countries and cause new conflicts, such as Russian invasion to Ukraine. This is obviously against any sense of humanity and dignity. Today's talks focused on the American civilizing mission in countries of Global South. Referring also to today's topic, it seems like two most powerful countries, Russia and the US, they are trying to conduct these missions in different parts of the world, using different kinds of weapons. After all, they both failed to do this. Is it because Russia, as well as the US, aim to set a cultural hegemony in other countries by violating cultural dignity or of other nation, without a deep understanding for the need of cultivation of historical memory, which is closely connected to the culture of each nation? Does it make them both even weaker, so the geopolitical order is even more out of balance?
Thank you. Can you read that question one more time? No, thank you. No, actually, I'm surprised that you would bring up the conference I was at in Warsaw about Jan Karski. And for those of you that know, Jan Karski is the Polish Schindler, in effect, who was a heroic man that actually was brought by the resistance into the concentration camps and then allowed to leave in order to tell the world what was happening in the camps. And it's a remarkable story of, he was a witness to the truth and how everyone greeted him with skepticism, thinking, no, it's impossible, is it really happening? So it was the conference in Poland, which was, I think, the centenary of his birth. That was the occasion in Poland. Well, I mean, this whole question about America, Russia, power, hegemony, it's a very complex question, and I don't have all the answers, even if I had all the time. But I think that those are important issues to consider. But I want to step back and make a proposition that the problem is not about power. The problem is about our lack of understanding of how power corresponds to reality. Now, when I was in the UN, in Bosnia, for example, we said the perpetrators of ethnic cleansing must be prosecuted. And the diplomats who were negotiating a peace agreement told us, well, that's naive and unrealistic. You must be realistic, the political realism kind of school of thought, that we need to negotiate with these same warlords and genocidal killers. So you human rights activists are foolish and naive. This is within the UN, because I was working with the UN in the human rights area, and then there were those that were working on the peace agreement. So why do I say this? Because in the end, they came to the realization that even from the point of view of stabilization and demilitarization of Bosnia, they couldn't achieve their objective unless they removed the likes of Radovan Karadzic and Ratko Mladic, who were, the ethnic entrepreneurs who had a vested interest in destabilizing the country. So the reason why NATO began to arrest the people that we had indicted is not because of lofty ideals, but because of the realities on the ground. Why do I give this as an example? Because those that exercise power still through violence and through corruption and through narrow, short-sighted interests are unrealistic. They are stupid. It's not a question of, oh, they're cynical, but it's a case of brilliant genius, evil genius. They're actually stupid. They don't understand even their own interests. They don't understand what it means to have a sustainable policy. And authoritarian regimes make mistakes in a different way, democratic regimes in a different, because of the election cycle and the kind of, reactive policies that have to be created. So I would suggest that the reality of the world is interdependence. Interdependence, when Marshall McLuhan talked about the global village, it was still a very romantic idea. Today we realize not everything about globalism is nice. There's a dark side to globalization as well, but it's nonetheless a reality. And it's a reality which is intensifying. And as I explained, even the so-called jihadists in Mosul in Iraq is part of our common culture at some level. So this increasing contraction and shrinking of the world, the emergence of common interests in the areas of the environment, the economy, human rights, migration, and so many other areas, but more profoundly, the emergence of a common identity. I talked about Facebook Nation, and for better or worse, even the Mech world. I mean, there's a dark side to the homogenizing culture. There are other sides which are very beneficial as well. So the reality is that those that stand in the way of this reality of interdependence are going to lose in the end. I just share one last point just to illustrate what I'm talking about. After working with the UN for about 10 years in Bosnia and Rwanda, and I'd had enough. I was, sinking into this dark abyss. I said, that's it. I've had enough. To hell with human rights. I'm going to go practice corporate law in New York. So I went to New York just before September 11th, 2001. Perfect timing. And it was a remarkable experience for me because on that day, my then wife and 2-year-old boy and my parents were going to the World Trade Center. And for several hours, the telephone lines were down. I had no idea, are they dead? Are they alive? Are there more attacks? And it was remarkable because unlike Bosnia and Rwanda, I couldn't get in the UN airplane and leave. It was all of a sudden my family. And it was remarkable to see how people in New York, in this frenetically busy, materialistic, ambitious city, all of a sudden were faced with death. And actually, a lot of babies were made right after September 11th. I'm not joking about this. This is actually true. But it was incredible to see the effect which that had on people's understanding of life and belonging and those that are near and dear to you. So why do I say this? Because just before September 11th, I was reading an essay called The Limbs of No Body. And I don't know how many of you have seen the film Kandahar by Mohsen Makhmalbaf. It's a brilliant, brilliant film made by my dear friend, award-winning Iranian filmmaker Mohsen Makhmalbaf, who is famous for reality TV, actually, one of the reality cinema, actually, one of the pioneers of reality cinema. So he makes movies with ordinary people. He doesn't have actors in his films. And he went to an Afghan refugee camp, and he made a film about a woman from Ottawa who's going back to Kandahar to rescue her sister, who is in such despair under the Taliban, this was the time of the Taliban still, that she wants to take her own life. And it's a remarkable, remarkable film. So The Limbs of No Body is from a poem by the Persian Sa'di from the 13th century, which says that all people are the limbs of one body. I think the English translation is all people, all human beings are members of one whole, created in essence from one soul. And it's a story of interdependence, that if one part is afflicted with pain, then the other parts will also feel that pain. So this was very poetic 800 years ago. But then on that morning of September 11th, as I watched in horror, from my Manhattan skyscraper fancy office, what was going on, I remembered Makhmalbaf's essay, because he had said that the people of Afghanistan are suffering and no one cares. It's like they're the limb that was cut off, that no one feels the pain of. And when I saw what happened, I said, well, no, now we understand the reality of interdependence. To me, that was the reality of September 11th, that a country which for 10 years under Soviet rule faced a genocide of 2 million people, where we threw in weapons to the jihadists when it served our interests, and then we just withdrew. We said, Soviet Union is defeated. We have no other interest in Afghanistan. to hell with the people of Afghanistan. Who cares about them? And what happened eventually is that that festering wound, that traumatized society awash with jihadists and weapons, came back and exploded in our face, in the sort of what was once unthinkable in the heart of New York. So today, we have to ask the same thing about ISIS. Where did ISIS come from? I don't have time to get into, the politics of the Middle East. But Saddam Hussein, where was the West in relation to Saddam Hussein during the Iran-Iraq war? Well, we supported Saddam Hussein. And when he killed 200,000 Kurds with poison gas in 1988, no one was willing to say anything. We only noticed when he invaded Kuwait. ISIS, which are the regimes that were behind extremism in the region as an instrument of power? We only noticed when things got to this point. So we have to understand that these evils don't happen overnight. They're the result of cynical, short-sighted politics. And we need visionary, enlightened leaders that are not dismissed as naive idealists, but as those that understand the realities of interdependence in an age of globalization. Last question, I think.
Hello. You mentioned a couple times that even those that challenge human rights are not rejecting it per se, but rather are trying to appropriate it and clothe it in their own culture. I was wondering if you can expand on that, mostly because of my lack of understanding of how human rights are employed in other places outside of North America, especially since all that we're exposed to when we see like what we understand as rejected human rights is people who are denied, burial rights or education or not allowed to have legal representation. To me, those things are like blatant rejection of human rights. And I was wondering if you could just explain a little bit more what you meant by appropriation or like cloaking it in their own culture.
That's a very good question, and there are different dimensions to your question. So for example, let's say in Iran, if you read the Constitution says that every accused person has a right of legal representation. But when someone actually represents a defendant who is, political prisoner, then the lawyer is put in prison. And then the lawyer that represents the lawyer is put in prison. And this is not a joke, the lawyer of the lawyer of the lawyer of the lawyer ends up in prison. So that's the reality of the arrogance and corruption of power, but still on the books, they still say that everyone has the right of legal representation. So the fact that they even feel the need to pay lip service to it is itself a sign that this has become the currency of power, not just internationally, but within that society itself. And even at the UN Human Rights Council, where just a few days ago Iran had its Universal Periodic Review, you have this man, Mr. Larijani, who's head of the Human Rights Council of Iran, who's a notorious figure, but he still has to come and speak about the human rights right. It's a total, delusion. It's, fiction, science fiction. But he still has the need to come and justify the record of Iran by reference to human rights, even if in certain areas there may be disagreements. What I want to maybe say is that they're very different societies with different realities, and sometimes it's not about the fact that someone's belief system is immutable, that it can never be changed. So for example, Sharia law, we talk about Sharia law as if it has a fixed, incontestable meaning. There are many different schools of thought, even in the traditional schools of Sharia law. I don't know, you have Wahhabism, the Jafari school, and I'm not a scholar of Shia jurisprudence, but there are many, many different schools, many different interpretations, and there are many modern interpretations of devout Muslims who say that, I disagree with your interpretation of the Quran. This is my interpretation. So it's not so much a clash of civilizations, it's much more a clash within those societies. And if we understand what is at the root of those clashes, sometimes we see that no society is a fossil in a museum that we look at, which is why I was upset about how, not just Professor Hopgood and others, but say, human rights is a Western concept, and the rest of the world will not accept it because they're different. As if the rest of the world is this fossil in a museum that's never going to change, that's never receptive to new ideas, that's not evolving from tradition to modernity. So I just wanted to end by saying that I spent this few days ago with the Afghanistan Human Rights Commission, and there was a man there who some claim was Taliban, others say is not, but he spent 3 years in Bagram Air Force Base as a prisoner of war, and he went to the madrasas in Pakistan, which were the schools where, sort of a very radical brand of, Islam was preached. And I just sat and I spoke with this man. I spoke some of his, Afghan Dari language, and he spoke some English, and we managed to communicate somehow. So he believed that the Sharia law must be the law in Afghanistan, and he believed that he accepted there should be no torture, there should be no this, there should be no that, but he believed that anyone who changes his religion from Islam is an apostate and should be subject to criminal punishment. And he sort of said that, I will go 80% of the way with you, but this is where I stop. And I said, well, that's fine. We can agree to disagree, and we can engage in a dialogue. But what was more interesting is when I heard his story about what happened to his family. Where do you think the Taliban came from? We demonize the Taliban. Understandably, they visited tremendous cruelty upon the people of Afghanistan. These were the children who were orphans or whose parents couldn't feed them. They were starving. The madrasas, with Saudi money and with American blessing, gave them food in exchange for this radical preaching, and then they were recruited to become the Taliban foot soldiers. So when you hear that story, you move away from the abstract to the intimate, and you actually feel sorry for this man. You actually have empathy for him. You say, my goodness, what would it have been like if, I don't know, at age 6, you saw your father blown to bits by, a Soviet tank? What trauma does that create in a small child? How is that going to affect? Do you expect this child to come out as, psychologically balanced individual? Of course not. So we think that we're going to go into Afghanistan, we're going to bomb the country for a few years, and it's going to turn into Sweden. Well, it's not. It's not. It's a country that lost a third of its population. A third of the population were refugees, and the other third were traumatized beyond belief. So go figure. It's going to take a long-term commitment to rebuild that society. And that's why our attention span has to go beyond sort of instant gratification, flavor of the month, what is the sexy topic on the news today. And to me, the human rights heroes are not the celebrities and the people that you hear lecturing here in University of Ottawa, whatever, but it's those people that serve in those communities quietly for years and years. They commit themselves to years just to make a difference in a small community. And they do have an impact, and they are able to change things. So we shouldn't set ourselves up for disappointments and to think that, well, if I have an internship in the summer and I can't improve the human rights situation in Sudan, then I should be disappointed. Well, no, that's not the way it works. So I just want to end by saying that we have far more power than we imagine, but we have to look for it in the right place. And I think that that brings us to 9 o'clock, and I've now billed you for 2 hours. So I think you don't want me to bill you for a third hour. Thank you very much.
My name is Jane Stoyles. I'm the founder of the Philippe Kirsch Institute, and I was asked just to take a few moments, well, not a few moments because it's late, a moment to close our event tonight. In doing that, I wanted to make sure that you're aware of some of the other upcoming programs that might interest you. The Center for International Policy Studies, which is one of the co-hosts this evening, has ongoing programs all year here at the university in English and French. And there's a sign-up sheet on the table at the back that where you can leave your email address and be on their newsletter to receive notices of that. Also wanted to mention that the Philippe Kirsch Institute has a number of programs on topics related to human rights in the Canadian context, many of which are available through the website. And there are a couple of upcoming programs in person in Toronto related to the use of secret evidence in Canadian courts and corporate social responsibility. And all of the proceeds of those programs fund the Canadian Centre for International Justice. So it's my really great pleasure to offer our sincere thanks to Dr. Akhavan for being with us tonight on behalf of the event organizers, the Baha'i Community of Ottawa, the Center for International Policy Studies, and the Kirsch Institute. And I was particularly heartened to see this room bursting at the seams tonight for an event that ended at 9 o'clock in a city where you may be aware the restaurants tend to close by 5:30 in the downtown core, and there's no one to be seen. So it's quite an accomplishment. Perhaps that will give you that blessing that you are great enough, I think, Dr. Akhavan, to be humble at this point. I do find your presentations always extremely engaging, and you've given us a lot of food for thought tonight, and particularly appreciated this challenging of a lot of the common frameworks that we hear in the discourse, and it's such a timely topic in this question of human rights in the context of extremism. So I thank you for everything that you provided for us tonight, and also the call for some self-reflection and call to think about how we act in response to some of these challenges. So I wanted to end with a quote from the description of the lecture tonight that I think perhaps you provided, Dr. Akhavan. Instead of a retreat away from human rights, the challenge in the years ahead will be to expand our understanding of dignity beyond formal norms and institutions towards deeper spiritual understandings of justice, community, and belonging. So that's some food for thought as we leave tonight, and if you could all join me in thanking Dr. Akhavan again.